If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. The protector of the power lines. I've never felt fear quite like this before, and to be honest, even now when I think about it, my chest tightens. This happened a few years ago when my cousin Jason and I went hunting in the woods near my uncle's property. It's a pretty isolated spot, mostly quiet except for the occasional crackle of power lines that stretched through a clearing not too far from where we were camping. We had been out all morning, moving further away from the campsite, tracking what we thought was a deer. The air felt heavy that day, like it does before a storm, but there wasn't a single cloud in the sky. As we pushed deeper into the woods, Jason nudged me and whispered, "There's someone up ahead." At first, I thought it was a joke. He loved messing with me, but when I looked where he was pointing, I froze. A man was standing maybe 30 yards away, just barely visible between the trees. He wasn't wearing hunting gear, just this dirty jacket and jeans, and he was holding a knife. Not like a utility knife or anything. You know, one of those long hunting knives that gleam in the sunlight. He wasn't moving, just staring at us. I'm not proud of how I reacted. My first instinct was to back away slowly, but Jason whispered, "No sudden moves." The man didn't say anything. He just tilted his head like he was trying to decide something. My cousin, always the braver one, muttered that we should circle back toward the campsite. It was probably just someone out hunting or cutting through the woods, right? But the more we moved, the more it felt like he was shadowing us, keeping the same distance but always staying within view. It wasn't until we were about halfway back that we realized he wasn't alone. Another figure stepped out from behind some trees, a woman this time, just as dirty and wild looking. She wasn't holding a knife, but her expression was wrong. It's hard to describe. Like she was too calm, given the situation. Jason and I locked eyes for a split second, and that's when we knew this wasn't some coincidence. These people were following us. We picked up the pace, trying to stay calm but moving fast enough to put some distance between us and them. The woods felt suffocating, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig making me jump out of my skin. I kept glancing back, and every time, they were still there, weaving through the trees like they knew the terrain better than we did. By the time we reached the clearing with the power lines, my heart was pounding. Jason stopped suddenly and said under his breath, "They're closing in." I turned around, and sure enough, the man was moving faster now, his knife in plain view. The woman had vanished, which somehow made it worse. My legs felt like jelly, but Jason grabbed my arm and said, "Run." We bolted across the clearing, heading straight for the trail that would lead us back to camp. My lungs were burning, and I could hear Jason cursing under his breath. The sound of the man's footsteps behind us grew louder, and then I heard him shout something. Words I couldn't make out, but the tone was aggressive, like he was commanding us to stop. I risked a glance back and saw him breaking into a full sprint, knife raised. That's when Jason made a split-second decision that probably saved our lives. He grabbed a big stick lying on the ground and turned to face the guy. "Keep going," he yelled at me, his voice shaking but firm. I didn't want to leave him, but I could tell he wasn't asking. He was giving me time to get help. I ran like my life depended on it, because it did. My boots slipped on the uneven ground, and I nearly face-planted twice before the campsite finally came into view. I burst into the clearing, yelling for help so loud that my throat felt like it was tearing apart. Our group was already on edge after hearing us shouting in the distance, and I barely managed to spit out, "There's a guy. He's chasing Jason. He has a knife," before collapsing to my knees. A few of the older guys in our group grabbed whatever they could. Axes, a hatchet, even a metal rod from the fire pit, and took off toward the trail. I sat there, gasping for air and praying they'd get to Jason in time. The wait felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before I heard shouting and the sound of heavy footsteps. Jason and the others came sprinting back into the campsite, with the man trailing behind at a safe distance. His whole demeanor had changed. He wasn't charging anymore, but he wasn't leaving either. He stood just beyond the tree line, pacing like a caged animal, his eyes darting between all of us. The guys in our group shouted at him to back off, waving their makeshift weapons, but he just stood there, gripping the knife so hard his knuckles turned white. That's when someone in the group mentioned they'd seen a homeless encampment not too far from here, hidden along the power lines. "This guy's probably one of them," they said. "They're bad news, violent." Jason, still catching his breath, muttered, "No kidding." The man didn't retreat easily. For what felt like an eternity, he just stood there, staring us down like he was weighing his chances. The tension was unbearable. None of us knew what he was capable of, but we weren't exactly eager to find out. Then, out of nowhere, he let out this guttural yell, like a mix of frustration and rage, before turning and disappearing back into the trees. Nobody relaxed, though. We kept hearing rustling in the woods, like he was still nearby, maybe circling us. One of the older guys in the group, a seasoned hunter named Pete, said, "We're not staying here another night." It wasn't a suggestion. Everyone nodded, already packing up the campsite in record time. But Jason wasn't ready to let it go. What if he comes back? What if he's not alone? He asked, and his voice cracked just enough to make everyone stop for a second. Pete sighed and said we'd check the area before heading out. A few of them, Jason included, grabbed flashlights and cautiously made their way back toward the power lines where we'd first seen the man. I stayed behind, trying to keep myself busy by packing up, but every little sound made me jump. After about 10 minutes, they came back, looking pale. "There's a whole camp out there," Jason said quietly, and the word sent a chill down my spine. Pete explained they'd found tarps, fire pits, and even some makeshift shelters tucked away in the brush. And it's not just one guy. There's stuff everywhere, enough for a whole group. He didn't need to say more. We all understood what that meant. We weren't dealing with just one crazy man. This was a group, and for all we knew, they could have been watching us the entire time. We left in a hurry, not even bothering to fully clean up the campsite. Pete and a couple of others kept watch, weapons in hand, as the rest of us loaded up the trucks. Every crunch of leaves or snap of a twig sent us spinning around, expecting the man, or worse, his whole group, to come charging out of the woods. But the forest stayed eerily silent. Too silent. Even the birds had stopped chirping. It wasn't until we were all packed up and driving down the narrow dirt road that I felt like I could breathe again. Jason sat beside me in the truck, his leg bouncing uncontrollably. He kept glancing out the window like he expected someone to be following us. I didn't say anything, but I felt it too, that nagging feeling that we weren't out of danger yet. As we passed under the power lines one last time, something caught my eye. On the edge of the clearing, standing just behind a row of trees, was the man. He was watching us, his figure barely visible in the fading light. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were at least 3 more figures standing behind him, their shapes blurred by the distance and shadows. None of them moved. They just stood there, like they wanted us to know they were watching. I turned to Jason, my voice trembling. "Did you see?" He cut me off, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "Don't look back," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Just don't." I didn't argue. We drove the rest of the way in silence. The image of those figures burned into my mind. To this day, I don't know what their deal was or why they targeted us. I've heard stories about the homeless camp by the power lines, rumors of drugs, violence, and people disappearing, but I've never gone back to see for myself. And I never will. Whatever was going on in those woods, It felt like we barely got out alive. The serial killer in the camp. I was about 10 years old when it happened, in the summer of 1998. My mom and I had this tradition of going camping together every year, just the two of us. She was a single mom, and these trips were her way of making sure we had some real bonding time away from the world. That year, we decided to drive out to a state park about 3 hours from home. It wasn't our usual spot, but Mom had heard it was less crowded, with lots of trails and a gorgeous lake. I remember being excited, mostly because she let me pack a bag of marshmallows and promised we'd make s'mores every night. The park was beautiful but eerily quiet when we arrived. There were only a few other cars in the parking lot, and I remember my mom commenting that it was strange for a weekend in July. We set up our tent in a secluded spot near the edge of the woods, right by a narrow trail that led down to the lake. It felt peaceful at first, like we had the whole place to ourselves. That first night, we made a fire, cooked hot dogs on sticks, and talked until the stars came out. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves. The next morning, things started to feel off. When I woke up, there was a man sitting at the edge of our campsite, on a log near the dying embers of our fire. He looked scruffy, with a bushy beard and clothes that seemed too big for him, like he'd borrowed them from someone else. He was holding a large hunting knife, the kind with a serrated edge, and sharpening it with this slow, deliberate motion. My mom must have seen him too, because she stepped out of the tent right behind me and froze. I could feel her hand on my shoulder tighten, like she was holding me in place. The man noticed us watching him and smiled. Not a warm smile, though. It was this tight, thin-lipped grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning," he said, his voice gravelly. "You ladies doing okay out here? I saw your fire last night. Thought I'd keep an eye out, make sure no wild dogs came sniffing around." His words didn't quite match his tone. There was something off about the way he said wild dogs, like he didn't mean actual animals. My mom, trying to stay calm, smiled back and thanked him, though her voice had this tightness to it, like she was forcing the words out. "We're fine, but thank you for checking on us," she said. She was always polite to strangers, but I could tell by the way she kept her hand on my shoulder that she didn't trust him. The man didn't move, though. He just kept sitting there, dragging the blade of his knife across the sharpener with that awful scraping sound over and over. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, but at that age, I didn't really understand why I was so scared. I just knew that something about him wasn't right. After a few awkward seconds, Mom said, "Well, we've got breakfast to make. Thanks again." She turned me toward the tent and gave me a little nudge, whispering, "Stay close." I didn't ask questions, but I could feel her tension as we moved around camp, pretending to go about our morning routine. Every time I glanced back, the man was still there, watching us with that unnerving smile, sharpening his knife. He didn't leave until we started to pack up a bag for a hike, muttering something about checking the trail as he wandered off into the woods. My mom and I exchanged a look, but neither of us said anything about it. The day passed uneventfully, but my mom seemed jumpy the whole time, always looking over her shoulder. She even cut our hike short, saying the air felt too humid for a long walk, though I knew it wasn't that hot. When we got back to the campsite, there was a bundle of sticks stacked neatly by the fire pit. It didn't seem like much at first, a pile of kindling someone had left, but then we saw that one of the sticks had been shaved down to a point, like a spear. My mom's face went pale when she saw it. She didn't say a word, just grabbed my arm and said, "Let's make dinner quick tonight." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, my mom insisted on keeping the fire going brighter than usual. She kept tossing in more logs, even when the flames were already high. "It keeps the bugs away," she said, but I could tell she was more worried about keeping the campsite lit. Every rustle in the woods made her head snap up, her eyes darting toward the sound. I didn't want to admit it, but I was getting scared too. The forest that had felt so peaceful the night before now seemed alive, like it was holding its breath. Just as we were roasting marshmallows, the man came back. This time, he didn't sit down. He stood at the edge of the firelight, just far enough into the shadows that I couldn't see his face clearly. "Evening," he said, his voice low and casual, like he was an old friend stopping by. He was holding the knife again, twirling it between his fingers. My mom stiffened immediately. "Hello again," she said, her voice tight. "Can we help you with something?" She stood up and placed herself between me and the man, her body tense like she was ready to spring into action. He shrugged, still twirling the knife. "Just making sure you're safe out here. Lot of dangerous things in these woods. Wild dogs, you know." There it was again, that strange way he said wild dogs, like it was some kind of private joke. My mom didn't laugh. She crossed her arms and said, "We're fine. Thanks for checking, but we've got everything under control." For a moment, he didn't move, just stood there in the shadows, watching us. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional chirp of a cricket. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right then," he said, almost too softly to hear. "You ladies have a good night." He turned and disappeared into the trees, the knife glinting once in the firelight before he was gone. After he left, my mom's whole demeanor changed. She started packing things up immediately. Dishes, the food bag, anything that wasn't nailed down. "We're leaving first thing in the morning," she said, her voice low but firm. I didn't argue. I could feel her fear now, like it was radiating off her. She didn't even let the fire die out completely before we crawled into the tent for the night. "If you hear anything," she whispered as we lay there, "don't say a word. Just stay quiet." I don't know how long I lay awake, staring at the shadows on the tent walls. The air felt heavy, and every little noise outside made my heart race. I could hear my mom breathing next to me, shallow and fast. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard it. A soft crunch of leaves, deliberate and slow. It wasn't the random rustling of an animal. This was the sound of footsteps, someone trying to move quietly but not quite succeeding. My mom's hand found mine in the dark, squeezing so hard it hurt. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, but the silence felt worse somehow, like whoever it was had paused just outside the tent. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. Then came a sound I'll never forget, a soft scraping noise, like metal sliding against fabric. It was so quiet, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, but my mom heard it too. She sat up slowly, reaching for the flashlight she kept by her sleeping bag. Before she could turn it on, something heavy bumped against the side of the tent. Just once, like someone testing the fabric. The bump against the tent made my mom freeze, her hand gripping the flashlight so tight her knuckles turned white. We sat there, barely breathing, listening. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything went quiet again. No footsteps, no rustling, just the faint chirp of crickets in the distance. My mom leaned close and whispered, "Stay here," so softly I almost didn't hear her. Before I could protest, she unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, her flashlight still off. She stayed like that for what felt like forever, her face tense and her breathing shallow. When she finally zipped the tent back up, her voice was shaking. "We're not waiting until morning," she said. "We're leaving now." She started gathering our things in the dark, moving quickly but as quietly as she could. I wanted to ask what she'd seen, but something in her expression told me not to. It was like she was on autopilot, focused on one thing: getting us out of there. We didn't bother taking down the tent. My mom just grabbed our bags and whispered for me to stay close. We left most of our gear behind and started down the trail toward the parking lot, using the flashlight sparingly so we wouldn't trip. The woods felt impossibly dark, every shadow a potential hiding spot. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man stepping out from the trees, his knife glinting in the dim light. Then, just as we reached the edge of the parking lot, I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps, this time faster, closer. I looked back and saw a figure moving between the trees, too far away to make out details, but close enough to know we were being followed. My mom must have seen it too, because she grabbed my arm and broke into a run. We sprinted the last few feet to the car, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. My mom fumbled with the keys as we reached the car, her hands trembling so badly she almost dropped them. "Get in," she hissed, shoving me into the passenger seat. She yanked open the driver's door, and as soon as we were both inside, she locked all the doors and jammed the key into the ignition. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the empty parking lot. Empty, except for a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was the man, his face just barely visible in the beams of light. He wasn't running toward us or hiding anymore. He was just standing there, watching. The engine roared to life, and my mom threw the car into reverse so hard I thought the transmission might break. We peeled out of the lot, gravel flying, and she didn't slow down until we were back on the highway. Only then did I notice she was crying, silent tears streaming down her face as she gripped the wheel. "It's okay now," she said, though I wasn't sure if she was trying to convince me or herself. I didn't say a word the whole drive home. It wasn't until years later that I found out the truth. I was in my 20s, home for a weekend visit, when my mom casually mentioned that she'd seen something on the news about an old cold case finally being solved. A serial killer who had been active in the late 90s, targeting campers and hikers in state parks across the region. They'd finally caught him, but not before he'd murdered at least 8 people. My mom's voice shook as she described his mugshot, the same scruffy beard, the same tight-lipped grin. She looked at me and said, "It was him, wasn't it? That man from the campsite." I felt a chill run through me as the memories came flooding back. The knife, the sharpened stick, the footsteps outside the tent. We'd gotten lucky, incredibly lucky. I think about it sometimes, how close we came to being another headline, another unsolved mystery. I still don't know why he let us go that night, but the thought haunts me. Maybe it was because my mom kept her guard up. Or maybe he was just waiting for the right moment. Either way, I never went camping again. The teenage stalker. I used to take this wooded path to work every day after school. It wasn't the shortest route, but it saved me from walking along a busy highway where cars zipped by at insane speeds. The path cut through a small patch of forest, mostly quiet except for birds and the occasional rustle of squirrels. I had walked it 100 times before without a second thought, but that day, God, that day was different. From the moment I stepped into the trees, I felt off. It's hard to explain, but you know when you just feel like you're being watched? That kind of prickly sensation at the back of your neck? I brushed it off as paranoia at first, but by the time I was halfway through the trail, I was gripping my bag so tightly that my knuckles turned white. It started small, little things that didn't make sense. About 5 minutes in, I saw a magazine lying open on the ground. It was weird because it wasn't dirty or crumpled, like something that had been there for days. It looked fresh, like someone had just dropped it. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. I kept walking, but a few steps later, there was another magazine. This one was propped up against a tree, like it had been placed there deliberately. My heart began to race, but I told myself I was being silly. Someone probably dumped a stack of old magazines, right? But then I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of leaves behind me. Slow, deliberate, like someone was matching my pace. I froze in place, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence, so I told myself it had to be an animal, a deer or something. But as soon as I started walking again, The sound started too. Crunch, crunch. The steps weren't heavy, but they weren't light either. They were deliberate. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but the path behind me was empty. I thought about calling out, but the idea of hearing a voice answer back made my stomach twist. Instead, I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. Then I saw another magazine. This one was different. It was folded in half and had a jagged tear, like someone had ripped it in anger. It was lying right in the middle of the path, impossible to miss. My stomach dropped. This wasn't random. Someone was leaving them, and they wanted me to see them. I glanced around again, and that's when I caught it. Movement. Just the briefest flicker of something dark darting behind a tree. My breath hitched, and I took an involuntary step back. Whoever it was, they were close now. Way too close. I didn't wait to get a better look. My instincts kicked in, and I started walking faster, almost jogging, but I didn't want to run just yet. Running felt like admitting something was really wrong, and honestly, I was scared that if I did, whoever was out there would give chase. My brain was racing, trying to come up with explanations. Maybe it was just some kid messing around. Maybe someone dropped the magazines by accident, and the movement I saw was just an animal. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps had started again, faster this time, closing the distance between us. When I finally broke into a full sprint, it wasn't a conscious decision. It was pure instinct. The sound of my own footsteps pounding against the dirt was deafening, but I could still hear them behind me, heavier and more deliberate now, like whoever was back there wanted me to know they were chasing me. My bag bounced against my side, slowing me down, but I couldn't stop to adjust it. The path seemed to stretch forever, the trees closing in like walls. I thought about screaming, but the words caught in my throat. What if no one heard me? Or worse, what if the person chasing me didn't care? I could see the edge of the woods up ahead, the sunlight filtering through the trees like a lifeline. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning, legs screaming for a break. The footsteps behind me didn't stop, and they were so close now that I swore I could feel the vibrations in the ground. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, focusing on the clearing ahead. My mind raced with the worst possibilities. What if they caught me? What would they do? And then, for a split second, I thought I heard something other than footsteps. A low chuckle, barely audible but chilling enough to send my fear into overdrive. When I finally burst out of the woods and onto the sidewalk by the main road, I felt like I had escaped from a nightmare. Cars sped past, their drivers oblivious to the terror I had just experienced. I stumbled to a stop, doubling over to catch my breath, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. But even as I stood there, panting and shaking, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned to look back at the trail, half expecting to see someone emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the trees, standing silent and still. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe my mind had just played tricks on me, turning normal forest sounds into something sinister. But as I stood there, trying to convince myself it was nothing, I noticed something odd. A single magazine page was stuck to the sidewalk a few feet away, fluttering lightly in the breeze. It wasn't there when I'd started running. I was sure of it. I walked over to it, my hands trembling, and picked it up. It was a photo of a girl about my age, sitting on a swing, her face partially obscured by shadows. My stomach churned. It wasn't just creepy, it felt intentional, like it was meant for me. I didn't know what to do. Should I call someone? Go back and look for help? My phone was in my bag, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unzip it. As I fumbled with the zipper, I felt that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched. Slowly, I turned around, scanning the edge of the woods. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, there it was, a figure standing just inside the tree line, almost hidden by the shadows. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but they weren't moving, just standing there, watching me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the figure. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only a few seconds. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. They didn't step forward or make any sound. They just stood there, their outline barely visible against the trees. Then, just as I started to convince myself I was imagining it, they tilted their head to the side, like they were curious or amused. That small movement broke whatever spell I was under, and I bolted. I ran down the sidewalk, my breath coming in gasps, not caring if I looked crazy to the drivers passing by. I didn't stop running until I reached the small diner where I worked. I burst through the doors, earning a few startled looks from my coworkers, but I didn't care. I went straight to the back and locked myself in the bathroom, my chest heaving as I tried to calm down. I pulled out my phone to call someone. My mom, the police, anyone. But then I realized something that made my blood run cold. My phone wasn't in my bag. I must have dropped it somewhere in the woods. The idea of going back to look for it made my stomach turn, but without it, I felt trapped, like I was still being watched even inside the diner. I stayed in that bathroom for what felt like forever, my back pressed against the door as if that flimsy lock would somehow keep me safe. Every little noise outside made me flinch, a dish clattering in the kitchen, a customer laughing too loudly. It all sounded wrong, like it didn't belong in the world I had just escaped. Eventually, one of my coworkers knocked on the door, asking if I was okay. I lied, said I wasn't feeling well, and that I just needed a minute. The last thing I wanted was to explain what had happened. It sounded insane, even to me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't all in my head. That figure, those footsteps, the magazines. None of it was normal. When my shift finally ended, it was already dark out. The idea of walking home made my skin crawl, but I didn't have much choice. The diner was small, and most of my coworkers either lived in the opposite direction or didn't drive. I stuck to the main roads, avoiding the wooded path completely, but the entire time, I felt exposed. Every pair of headlights made my heart race, every shadow felt alive. When I finally got home, I locked the door behind me and checked every window, every corner of the house. Only then did I let myself breathe. But as I went to drop my bag by the door, something caught my eye, a magazine page sticking out of the side pocket. I froze. I didn't put it there. I didn't even know how it got into my bag. My hands were trembling as I pulled the page out of my bag. It was folded neatly, almost like a letter, and my stomach dropped as I realized it was the same page I had picked up earlier, the one with the girl on the swing. I knew I hadn't put it in my bag. I dropped it on the sidewalk when I saw the figure in the woods. My throat tightened, and my first instinct was to throw it away, but something stopped me. My curiosity, or maybe my fear, made me open it. On the back of the page, scrawled in jagged black ink, was a single word: run. I felt sick. This wasn't a coincidence. Whoever had been following me must have slipped it into my bag when I wasn't paying attention. But how? When? My mind raced, replaying every moment from the woods to the diner to my walk home. I didn't remember anyone coming close to me, but they must have. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I grabbed the page, crumpled it into a ball, and shoved it deep into the trash can. Then I locked myself in my bedroom, shoving a chair under the doorknob for good measure. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see that figure staring back at me. I barely slept that night. Every little creak of the house made me jump, and I kept replaying everything over and over in my head, trying to piece it together. By the time the sun came up, I had convinced myself I was safe. Maybe the person, whoever they were, had just been messing with me, trying to scare me for some sick thrill. I didn't believe it, not really, but I needed something to hold on to. I went about my day as normally as I could, though I avoided the woods entirely. It felt like everyone I passed on the street could have been them. Every face seemed suspicious, every smile hiding something sinister. That evening, just as I was beginning to relax, I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock at the front door. My stomach dropped. It wasn't loud, like a delivery driver or someone in a rush. It was slow and measured, almost like they were toying with me. I crept to the door as quietly as I could, peering through the peephole. At first, I didn't see anyone, and my heart began to race. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A figure was standing at the edge of my driveway, just barely visible in the dim light of the street lamp. They were still, just like they'd been in the woods, and even though I couldn't make out their face, I knew it was them. I backed away from the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to call someone, but I froze, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to move closer to the windows, afraid they'd see me. Instead, I crouched down by the couch, clutching my phone with shaking hands. When I finally managed to dial 911, my voice was barely above a whisper as I told the operator that someone was outside my house. They promised to send someone over, but as I hung up, I realized the figure was gone. I peered out again, this time through the edge of the curtain, but the driveway was empty. I waited by the door until I heard the police pull up. 2 officers knocked, and I opened the door, relieved to see them. They searched the yard and the area around the house, but didn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of anyone lurking. They tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a prank, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. When they left, I felt more alone than ever. That night, I sat in bed, staring at the locked door, hoping I'd wake up and it would all feel like a bad dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Whoever they were, they weren't done with me yet. The dancing figure. It was the fall of my sophomore year in college, a time when everything felt charged with possibility. Our weekends were usually spent chasing thrills, urban exploring, ghost hunting, or just finding new ways to freak each other out. That night, it was me, Jess, Milo, and Dana. Jess was the ringleader, always up for something insane. Milo was the skeptic, the guy who would roll his eyes at every spooky story but still tag along. Dana, well, she was the wild card, quiet until she wasn't, and her dares were always the most extreme. We'd heard about this old abandoned house deep in a wooded area just outside town. People whispered about it being haunted, the usual stuff, but one rumor stuck. Someone, or something, was often seen dancing in the moonlight near the house. Naturally, we had to check it out. The trek into the woods took longer than expected. It was colder than we'd prepared for, and the moon barely lit the narrow dirt path ahead. Jess had brought a flashlight, but its beam flickered like it might give out any second. The woods had that eerie quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just our footsteps crunching on the brittle undergrowth. We cracked jokes to keep the mood light, but even Milo's smirk was fading as the house came into view. It was more derelict than we'd imagined. Its roof sagged, and the windows were gaping black holes. There was something off about the place, something that made my stomach tighten. And then Dana whispered, "Do you hear that?" We stopped. At first, I thought it was just the faint hum of the forest, but then I caught it, a strange, rhythmic sound, almost like footsteps. But they weren't steady, they had this odd cadence, as if whoever, or whatever, was moving had an unnatural rhythm. We froze, all of us straining to hear over the sound of our own breathing. The rhythmic noise grew louder, and soon it wasn't just footsteps, it was accompanied by a faint, hollow tapping, like someone rapping on wood. Jess pointed her flashlight toward the house, but the beam wavered so badly it was useless. "Stop messing with it," Milo hissed, but she snapped back, "I'm not." That's when we saw it. A figure moved into the clearing in front of the house, illuminated by the silver glow of the moon. At first, it looked like a person, tall and thin, dressed in something that flowed as they moved. But their movements were all wrong, jerky, exaggerated, as if they were a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. They were dancing. Not gracefully, though. It was more like they were mimicking a waltz, but with a twisted, almost mocking energy. I felt Dana grab my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure's movements became more erratic, spinning and jerking with unsettling speed, their limbs flailing as if they were going to snap. And then they stopped, mid-spin, facing us directly. Even from that distance, I could feel the weight of their gaze. It pinned me in place, cold and sharp like a blade. Jess turned off the flashlight, plunging us into near darkness, but it didn't matter. The figure tilted its head, as if curious, and then began moving toward us. Not walking, charging. Its arms flailed as it moved, and its legs didn't quite bend the right way. "Run!" Jess screamed, breaking the spell, and we bolted, the sound of its uneven footsteps pounding behind us. The woods were a blur as we ran, branches clawing at our clothes and faces. I could hear Dana crying behind me, and Milo swearing under his breath. Jess, who was in the lead, yelled directions, but her voice was shaking so much I could barely make sense of it. The thing's footsteps were relentless, that irregular pounding never losing pace with us. Every so often, I'd glance back, and in the faint light of the moon, I'd catch a glimpse of it. A silhouette that moved like a glitch in a video game, jittering and twitching in ways that defied reason. I couldn't make out a face, just that horrible, lurching shape, getting closer and closer no matter how fast we ran. We finally broke through the tree line, stumbling onto the road where Milo had parked his car. "Keys. Keys." Jess was yelling, slapping Milo's jacket as he fumbled to pull them out. I dared to look back again, expecting to see the figure right behind us, but the edge of the woods was empty. No movement, no sound. My chest was heaving, and every nerve in my body was on edge, screaming that it wasn't over. "Get in the car!" Jess shouted. As soon as we were all inside, Milo started the engine, and the headlights cut through the dark. For a moment, I thought we were safe. But as the car roared to life and we sped off, Jess gasped, pointing to the rearview mirror. It was there, sprinting down the road behind us, its arms flailing in those grotesque movements, like it had no intention of stopping. Milo floored it, the tires screeching as we tore down the road. The thing didn't fall back. Not at first. It kept pace, its body contorting with every step, arms swinging like they were barely attached. I couldn't take my eyes off the rearview mirror, even though every part of me wanted to look away. Then it slowed, not like it was tired, but like it was losing interest. Its head tilted, almost lazily, before it stopped in the middle of the road and just stood there, watching us speed away. Even as the distance grew, I could see it faintly in the moonlight, standing still, like a crooked scarecrow. We didn't stop driving until we were back at campus. Milo parked haphazardly in front of the dorms, and no one said a word as we got out. Dana's hands were shaking so badly she could barely open the door to her room. Jess, usually the fearless one, sat on her bed and stared at the floor, muttering, "What the hell was that?" over and over. None of us had answers, and honestly, I didn't want to talk about it. We agreed not to tell anyone. No one would believe us anyway. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The erratic movements, the way its head tilted, like it was sizing us up. Part of me wondered if it had let us go. And if it had, why? The next day, Milo texted us something that sent a fresh wave of dread through me. He'd driven past the woods again, just to prove to himself it wasn't real. The house was gone. The clearing where it had stood was empty, overgrown with weeds, like it had never been there at all. None of us spoke much after Milo's text. We avoided the subject like it was cursed, each of us trying to push it to the back of our minds. But something lingered. Jess stopped joining us for our usual weekend outings, claiming she had too much work. Dana became jumpy, her wild, carefree streak replaced by a constant paranoia. Milo tried to laugh it off, making jokes about haunted marathons, but his laughter felt hollow, forced. And me? I couldn't stop thinking about the house, or the lack of it. I'd seen it with my own eyes, felt the chill in the air as we approached. How could it just be gone? Weeks passed, and life returned to something close to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't really escaped. One night, as I was studying in my dorm, I heard it. Faint, rhythmic tapping, coming from outside my window. My heart stopped. I lived on the 3rd floor. Slowly, I turned to look, dreading what I might see. But the window was empty, just the wind rustling the trees. Still, the sound didn't stop. It wasn't until I closed the curtains and sat back down that I noticed something on my desk. A single, muddy footprint, too large and too irregular to belong to any of us. I never told the others. What would I even say? To this day, I don't know what we saw in those woods. I've stayed far away from that area, and I don't go out at night anymore. But every so often, I still hear that tapping, faint and distant, like a warning or a reminder. Whatever it was, I don't think it was finished with us. Not yet. The green-eyed predator. I've been hunting since I was 12, and I've always felt more comfortable in the woods than in my own living room. There's a calm out there, a sense of peace you don't get anywhere else. So when I bought a small plot of land in rural Kentucky a few years back, it felt like a dream come true, a place all to myself where I could hunt whenever I wanted. I had a nice elevated deer stand set up on the edge of a clearing, overlooking a game trail I knew the deer used regularly. That night, I decided to head out for an evening hunt, planning to stay until well after sunset. The air was crisp, the kind that carries every sound for miles. It was just me, my rifle, and the forest. At least, that's what I thought. The first sign that something wasn't right came just after dusk. I had been sitting there for hours, scanning the trail through my scope, when I heard something in the woods behind me. At first, it was faint, just a couple of snaps, like twigs breaking underfoot. I figured it was probably a raccoon or maybe a coyote. But then the noises started getting closer, and they didn't sound like any animal I recognized. Heavy steps, deliberate and slow, crunching through the underbrush. My heart started pounding as I turned my head to listen. That's when I saw them. 2 glowing green eyes staring at me from the shadows. They were maybe 20 yards away, fixed on me, unblinking. And they were too high off the ground to be anything small. I froze, gripping my rifle tighter as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The eyes didn't move at first, just stayed locked on me like they were studying me. I couldn't see the body, just the glow of those eyes and the faint outline of something large shifting in the darkness. I aimed my rifle in that direction, but I couldn't bring myself to pull the trigger. What if it was a bear? Or worse, a person? The thought of shooting blindly made my stomach churn. Then it moved. Not towards me, but to the side, slow, deliberate steps circling around the base of my stand. I could hear every crunch of leaves, every snap of branches. Whatever it was big, and it didn't seem afraid of me. I kept my rifle trained on the sound, but my nerves were shot. I whispered to myself, trying to calm down, but my breathing was ragged, and my hands were shaking. Every time it got too quiet, I would think maybe it was gone, but then I'd hear it again, closer this time. At one point, it sounded like it was directly under my stand. I leaned over as far as I dared, trying to catch a glimpse, but all I could see was darkness and the faint shimmer of those green eyes just beyond the edge of my flashlight beam. I flicked the light on and off a few times, hoping to scare it, but it didn't even flinch. It just kept circling, like it was waiting for something. The hours crawled by, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this thing was, it wasn't just some animal. Animals get spooked. They run when they see a person, or at least keep their distance. This thing didn't care that I was there. If anything, it seemed to enjoy toying with me. Every few minutes, it would circle back to the same spot and just stare up at me, its eyes glowing like a pair of lanterns in the dark. At one point, I thought I could hear it breathing, a deep, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but it was so faint I wasn't sure if my mind was playing tricks on me. I felt trapped, pinned to that spot, afraid that even the slightest movement would provoke it. By the time the sky started to lighten, my nerves were completely shot. I hadn't moved in hours, and every muscle in my body was screaming in protest. The green eyes were still there, pacing in and out of the shadows, but as the first rays of sunlight started to filter through the trees, they seemed to retreat. I'll never forget how unnatural it looked. One moment, the eyes were glowing, reflecting the faint light, and the next, they were gone, swallowed up by the forest. No sound, no movement, just silence. I stayed up there for another hour, rifle in hand, before I finally worked up the courage to climb down. My legs were like jelly, and every step back to my truck felt like I was being watched. When I got to my truck, I practically threw my gear into the back and jumped into the driver's seat. The whole time, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting those glowing eyes to pop out of the tree line. I don't know how to explain it, but even in the safety of my truck, I felt exposed, like whatever it was could be just out of sight, waiting. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I felt a small wave of relief, until I realized something. The forest was silent. No birds, no wind, not even the usual rustling of leaves. Just this eerie, unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. Driving down the old dirt road that led off the property, I kept the windows up and my eyes glued to the rear-view mirror. I didn't see anything, but that didn't stop the feeling of being followed. Even when I hit the main road, the uneasiness didn't go away. I had planned to come back that weekend for another hunt, but as soon as I got home, I knew there was no way I was stepping foot on that land again. Over the next couple of weeks, I tried convincing myself it was just a bear or some other animal, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Bears don't move like that, and they sure as hell don't have glowing green eyes. I ended up listing the property for sale within a month. Every time I thought about going back, a wave of dread would hit me, like my body was trying to warn me. A few buddies of mine teased me about it, saying I was overreacting, but I didn't care. I never told them the whole story. I knew they wouldn't believe me anyway. Who would? Glowing green eyes, and something circling my stand all night, sounded like the plot of a bad horror movie. But I couldn't shake the memory of how deliberate it all felt, like it wasn't just an animal being curious, but something far more calculated. Even now, just thinking about it makes my stomach turn. Selling the place was the easiest decision I ever made. To this day, I refuse to hunt alone, especially at night. I've been out in the woods plenty of times since then, and nothing like that has ever happened again, but it left a mark on me. Sometimes, I'll catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those green eyes staring back at me. It's been years now, and I still don't have an explanation. Maybe it was an animal I didn't recognize, or maybe it was something else entirely. Something that doesn't belong in those woods, or any woods. All I know is that whatever it was, it didn't want me there. And I'll never forget how it made me feel. Small, vulnerable, and completely powerless.